My name is Eoghan Corry and I live over about a mile away from here in Clownings. I'd have grown up from the age of 3 in Ardclough. I'm not native to Ardclough, so there are people who will be more knowledgeable about Ardclough here than I am. But I would have grown up at a time when this was sort of still hanging on, that it was the centre of the community. You can actually truly say welcome to Ardclough here, which is unusual because the townland of Ardclough is exactly where Ardclough is now. Bears no resemblance to this, but when right up till 1985 people went to church, went to mass here in that. It's a private residence now, but that was the church for Ardclough. This building behind you, this fine building, was the school for Ardclough for 110 years. It was the school from the national school system came into action in 1834. The local landlord, Lord Cloncarry, Valentine Lawless, was on the board of the National Education Commissioners. So one of the first national schools in the country is that building behind you. In 1950 it was the school from all around to go to school here, and then what is now the village centre replaced it, and now we have St Anne's National School over towards where Tipperstown is. And that reflects what's happening here. This is Ardclough. Tipperstown is not Ardclough, but if you ask anybody where Ardclough is now, it's down in Tipperstown. And part of what we'll talk about is how that happened. Clough, even the name, it means obviously high stone, but we don't have a high stone in Ardclough, which raises a big question: is how did we get, in a very flat county, a name called Ardclough? Now, there's loads of theories. One of them is that Uachtaráir Cemetery was a convent founded by St Bridget, not the St Bridget of Kildare, as was suggested in an article in the Journal last week. It's actually a separate St Bridget, but it was a convent. So people have come up with the theory that that's Ardclough, the high convent. From very early times, the quality of the stone that was quarried here was a very high quality. So when we're talking about Ardclough, we're not talking about a high stone, we're talking about the quality of the stone going on. And we will be getting a rare look at one of the quarries, because the quarries are closed to public access, and the reason this townland became very important for a brief flourishing period of time. There's absolutely no mention of Ardclough in that map, where the canal has just been built. There's no canal in the 1750s map. A townland called Aclah. And that's the first sign of the word Ardclough on a map. And that raises another possibility, Ardclough. That would mean the field of stone. We're flat here, a field with stone in it. Could well be the place name. 1783, Taylor did his map. 1801, Rowe was surveying this area for Lord Cloncarry, Valentine Brown Lawless. And it has become Ardclough with the spelling we know today, Ardclough. Remember, the canal took 50 years to build. 1756, the first stretch of the canal was built up as far as the 13, where the 13th lock is now. And it was there in the 1780s. It probably means that this was now being looked at. There was something important here they were looking for, which to my mind was probably the stone that they were hoping to mine. And it's that little word there, Ardclough, and the church, the canal. This is the first map that actually shows the canal. It's long in advance of the Ordnance Survey, so it's not tremendously accurate. But that's the first sign we have of somewhere called Ardclough. And there are two interesting points about that map. The Ardclough is the other side of the bank here, so that's where the townland name was probably originally. If this is accurate, it mightn't be. And the second thing is, this little section here is in Lyons Parish, and the land in Lyons was owned by the Aylmer family at the time, and they obviously got this little section. Church you see behind you was built in 1810. Prior to that, there was a mass house here. At the time, as most of you will know, there were serious regulations as to where mass could be said. The mythology of the Mass Rock, all of that we've learned in our childhood, but there were specific legal requirements that a church had to be 1 mile outside a town. And all the 18th century churches, as opposed to what happened in the beginning of the 19th century, all the churches around here all came up in about a 10-year period. This was built in 1810, Newcastle was built in 1813, Kill was built in 1821. But the church of Ardclough was actually the parish church of Lyons, and that was the notice that was put on it. That was the little inscription that was put on it. Lyons Parish is actually The heart of Lyons Parish is over where Lyons House is now, and on the way up to the hill there is a Lyons Parish Church, which was prior to Henry VIII's time, the Parish Church of Lyons. Our Protestant church in Lyons eventually got transferred to Newcastle, but this little outpost of Lyons Parish was where the Catholic Church was put. Originally the Mass House, and in 1810 the Parish Church of Lyons. The Parish of Lyons was not just Lyons at that stage, it was the Parish of Lyons and Kill. And the church was built at the behest of the new resident of Lyons who'd taken over from the Aylmers. Nicholas Lawless was the guy who got hold of the Lyons House from the Aylmers because they owed a lot of money to him. And his son, Valentine Lawless, became a pretty important political figure from the 1790s on. He was one of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion. He ended up getting a peerage from the Queen of England. So that was quite a great turnaround and shows what an adept politician he was. In 1810, he built the Parish Church of Lyons, nice and safe, very far away from his home. Nobody could accuse him of being nice to the Catholics. So here it was, more than 1.5 miles away, and it's the Parish of Lyons Church. All around us is another parish, but this one was a little outpost of the Parish of Lyons, and he put the church here. He built it, he got a baptismal font as a present from Pope Pius VII, and that he got a crucifix as a present as well from the Vatican. And the new priest arrived in 1810 called Daniel Nolan, and Daniel Nolan fell out incredibly badly with Lord Cloncurry, moved his house to Painstown originally and then to Kill. 11 years after the Parish Church of Lyons was built in Ardclough, a second parish church is built in 1821 in Kill, and to this day Lyons has been the curacy, and Kill has been where the parish priest lived. The centre of the parish moved in that one stroke in 1821, and the story of Daniel Nolan and his fights with the Lord Cloncurry, Valentine Lawless, the second Lord Cloncurry, featured very heavily in the biographies of the Bishop of Kildare and Loughlin, JKL, James Warren Doyle, written by William Fitzpatrick. Some marvellous stories in it, none of them I expect to be true, like many biographers. I'm a journalist myself, and one of the stories was that he built windows on one side of the church so that when the light came in it wouldn't get back out again. Daniel Nolan was the subject of loads of letters from Lord Cloncurry to the bishop at the time, James Warren Doyle, and those letters are still extant. They're in Carlow in the diocesan archive there. The church came in 1810. 1810 we had a school built here. It was a pretty decrepit school by the inspector's accounts at the time, and that, I think, the original school ended up is probably the outhouse behind you, because it ended up as a residence for the teachers. A beautiful new school was built, the new national school system. It was sort of a model for what schools should be. Interestingly enough, the manager of the school normally was passed on to the local clergyman. In most cases that would be the parish priest. Always through the history of this school, it was the local landlord, Lord Cloncurry. So anything that happened in the school was at the behest of the landlord. That's the amount of power he had. And that was fine when the original Valentine Lawless was Lord Cloncurry. He showed a lot of initiative, he provided a lot of employment. His son didn't last very long, and then his grandson came to be the occupant of Lyons House, and he will feature very much in our stories because he became almost a caricature. The malevolence of Irish landlordism had become by the time we came to the 1870s and 1880s. To sum him up in one line, he was so fearful of assassination that he had a straight road built from Dangan in Selbridge to as close to the railway station in Hazelhatch as he could, and to this day it's known as the Lord's Road. The reason he had it built was he didn't want to be going around a corner where somebody would be waiting to ambush him on the other side. This cluster of buildings, they're out in the middle of nowhere now. That's the description that some people have used about it, even as early as 1903, 1904. Ardclough Church is on the canal bank in the middle of nowhere, but that is not what it appeared for the first 70 or 80 years after the church was built, because this was a thriving place. Remember I told you Ardclough moved. Ardclough, if you were to go back to the original Lyons, it was the hill, it was just below the hill where the house is now, where the castle is, there was a town there. That went into decline. When the canal was originally built around 1804, we had a cluster of buildings which are now the Clifford Lines. They became a teeming hive of activity because that was a stopover point on people travelling by flyboat on the canal. And this became, that was sort of a Lyons, you could almost say a Lyons town. And then from 1804, the first sinkholes went down here. Lord Cloncurry, Valentine Lawless, the first Valentine Lawless started working on the stone, and houses sprung up all along the canal bank and all the way back from the canal bank. And by 1891, it had all disappeared. So in that period, from the 1820s to the 1870s, this was thriving. People came to work from miles around all here. People were attracted from the length and breadth of the country, and they included the parents of our most notable resident in this little cluster of houses
but
here.
But originally
Mary
the hewn stone was used to build buildings,
and I don't know how verifiable it is where Ardclough stones ended up. The local folklore, and that's very often as accurate as anything, is that the county jail and the workhouse in Naas, which is now the hospital, the old building of the hospital, that was built with Ardclough stone. I've also heard tell that parts of the forecourts were built with Ardclough stone, but nobody's actually tracked who they were trading with at the time, and even getting the names of the people who managed the quarries has been difficult, and the history of the quarries themselves. But where the stone ended up, is there anybody else has an idea of what was built with Ardclough stone?
According to other local folklore, it said that a lot of stone went on the canal back in to build part of Guinness's. So
part of Guinness's, that would make sense.
And that would make sense because they had their own
harbour. And people say, like, we made a big deal out of Arthur Guinness, rightly so, the Guinness Trail, and Selbridge claims to be his birthplace. We have his burial place here in Oughterard. But Arthur Guinness really didn't leave that big a business behind him. It was his grandson that turned Guinness from being just another brewery into being a huge international name. And that building of the Guinness, on that Guinness land, that famous 999-year lease they have in James's Gate or along the canal, all of that building would have been taking place just as Ardclough stone was at its peak production, and the transport couldn't have been better because that was where the stone was loaded, right behind you there, and it was brought in by canal exactly to where Guinnesses were being built. So what you're saying, Michael, makes absolute sense.
Could I just make one small other point?
Yes.
It is very possible that there are substantial houses in this area that were built from the same limestone. I've done a lot on the history of the civil parish of Oughterard.
Yes.
The civil parish of Oughterard was Castle Warden House. The Castle Warden House was built in 1835, plus or minus, and it's made of rubble limestone. And the nearest limestone quarry that I can think of to Castle Warden has to be this one here.
Of course, yeah. Absolutely.
That stone up here for the grotto in Selbridge.
Oh, that's from here.
Yeah,
but when it was finally finished in 1803, the viability of bringing stone out of Ardclough suddenly changed. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is Main Street, Ardclough. This is the city centre, and don't get knocked down by the traffic. The school field.
There was a little stile there, and we used to get a drink of water there at the pump because there was no water laid on the school.
There was no water in the school. Okay. This is the minutes of the pump is the pump is right behind you. The Rural District Council of Selbridge number 1 will, at their meeting to be held on Friday, the 8th day of August 1913, up to but not later than 11 o'clock, receive and consider tenders for the sinking of a well and the erection of a public pump at Ardclough, in accordance with the provisions of a specification which may be seen at my office at all reasonable hours. That's F. Short, the Clerk of the Council in the Council Office in Selbridge, 22nd of July 1913. So if Mona is telling us there was no water in the school, that means that how many generations of school kids? And it's all very well for drinking, but what happened when little boys and girls have to go? Three outdoor toilets and no sewerage. And that's the church, the school in Strafford where the church is now.
And I remember the teacher
And which teacher was that?
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. It's too late.
Oh. So the good old days, Mona, bring them back, isn't that it?
Well, I can tell you, I remember being out in that hedge picking sticks to light the fire.
So we didn't have any global warming then.
It was
cold in the winter time. If there was snow out, the teacher used to bring us out, and you'd run right around the field and leave a track, and we'd be out there for an hour running around in the surf. And I can tell you, we'd be warm when we go back.
This had been thriving, and it came to a halt. The Ardclough Quarry of the Lord's Road, who was Valentine Frederick Lawless, he decided to lease it to a guy called Sullivan and then a guy called the Sexton. Quarry. When the Sexton's lease expired, the quarries ceased. Now, the quarries were originally for use in building, but in later years was used for kiln, to lime kilns, and was going to be shipped out on a daily basis. And we had a railroad here to the quarry, and it worked on gravity. There was no power system, so that the full carriages would pull the empty carriages, and they would load them up, let them off, and from the quarry to the canal bank, offloaded in the canal bank. There was a little quay down here, and that then loaded the barges, and off they went in whichever direction they were going, Naas to build the hospital or back to build the Guinnesses, as we just heard. And this is the Crossroads, as I say. The main street of Ardclough reaches the canal bank, and this was the centre for the performance arts. This is Coonan's Pub, and Coonan's Pub was a magnificent centre for the chaps coming in after a hard day's work from the quarry. It's a very small place, basically one living quarter, and then the public house, which was also groceries and provisions. And of course, a lot of people will remember that was sugar, more tea, and loose tea, and all of those sort of things.
I remember buying Sunday papers here.
Yeah, that was Dick Foynes' time. Yeah. Up to Dick Foynes would have died in the early 70s. Does anyone remember? It would probably be up to certainly in the 60s.
In a little lane down beyond us.
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember it being burnt down from the spark from our train.
Okay, this is going back in time to the Sunday the 20th. Okay, this is before Colonel Claude Kane, and he lived in Woolston's house, the Kanes, and he was the magistrate in Celbert. People know this is a court case. District Inspector Burke prosecuted Thomas Coonan of Ardclough for selling drink on Sunday the 26th of March 1911. Why was he being prosecuted? He only had a 6-day licence. So people were coming out of the church on Sunday, and they might have had a thirst on them. So Constable Connor swore, "I was on duty on the 26th of March. I had Coonan's house under observation. At about 4:40, I was lying in an ambush about 200 yards from the premises. I saw Miss Coonan come out, and when she noticed me, she went back. I went to the place and found two men named Canavan and Marr there. Canavan was finishing a pint of porter, and Marr said he wanted to get some potatoes. The defendant, being questioned by the constable, said he could not account for the men being on the premises. The defendant pleaded guilty and was fined 40 shillings and costs, and the licence to be endorsed. Lawrence Canavan and John Marr were prosecuted for being on the premises, and they were fined 5 shillings. But you'll be glad to know that Sergeant Connor, or Constable Connor, who obviously had more time in his hands than guards have nowadays, he came back and did another ambush, and he failed to prosecute anyone. So he spent his Sundays lying in the bushes around here. So if you're out late at night and you meet a ghost in a bush around here, it's probably Constable Connor. Now, bear in mind that there's another road going off here, and we're following this one here. What we're going to talk about in a little while is the number of houses that were here that were actually just knocked. What happened with Lord Cloncurry III, or the fourth actually, he was determined that all of this would come to, all the industry, all the activity that was down here would come to an end. And there's a word that is used by the parish priest in Kill, who engaged in a very combative exchange of letters with Lord Cloncurry. George Gowing was the parish priest's name, and he accused Corry of being evicting people, and he accused him of, we used the word clearances. That doesn't mean a lot now, but it was a very emotive word at the time because it was associated very heavily with the depopulation of Scotland. The Scottish, to this day, the population in Scotland is 9 people to the square kilometres, whereas the average European is 130. And the reason was that the landlords of Scotland offered you could have your arrears of rent cancelled if you go to America or Australia. And they cleared huge amounts of estate which were farmed, or lands that were farmed, to turn them into, first of all, pasturage for sheep, but also just for shooting pheasants, so that they didn't have people around. And the accusation against Lord Cloncurry is that he had a thriving community here in Ardclough. He had quarries that were probably not making as much money as they used to, but they were still workable, and he closed them down, and then he knocked the houses. And we know this because there was a series of investigations under Farm Labourers Acts. There was no real legislation for quarry workers, but there was Farm Labourers Acts, and they did investigations as to what had happened, the population of Ardclough, and where had all these people gone. John Doyle and his family, Nicholas Bryan and his family, Michael Coffey and his family, Mrs. Coffey and 3 orphan children, Ed Kelly and his family, William Shea and his family, and he says these people were evicted. They didn't actually get the pictures in our school history books of the RIC with the tripod, but he made life so difficult for them, they had to pull out. He owned the houses, he owned the quarries, and he had all of these people around Ardclough, and he was determined to get them out. He also said, I find no trace of the following families who once resided in these localities, all of whom were substantial people. The family of Barry, Howe, Patrick Hannon, Hopkins, Andrew Hope, James Nally, Mrs. Keegan, and the brackets were land taken. So even if he didn't serve, like he said, Cloncurry was known for evicting people in Limerick. But even if he didn't serve them with eviction notices like he did in Limerick, he had made life so difficult for them. All of these families who lived here, this thriving community, we get gone. A little clue into the mentality of this guy. Michael's very familiar with this. Is the Pigeon family in the 1850s had spent £1,500 building a house on what is now Pigeons Hill over at Castle Warden. You can imagine the size of the house you build for £1,500 in 1810 when people were earning £20 a year. £20 a year was a good wage then. So when Cloncurry got hold of the land, it was leased from somebody else. Cloncurry bought it out, made life difficult for the pigeons the same way as he did for people here. They went to Australia, and then he knocked the house. And George Gowing, Cloncurry made this incredible plea to defend his reputation, saying, I've been doing my best, all the quarries closed, I tried to find alternative employment for them. He employed an awful lot of them on my own farm, and George Gowing, the parish priest, said, the only employment you've provided, sir, was in knocking down Pigeon's house. And he knocked down the house and sold everything he could of the contents. And the accusation is quite unusual in Irish landlord history, is that this guy just didn't want buildings around him. So we ended up in this incredible situation where Ardclough had fewer buildings on our Ordnance Survey map of 1911, and those 6-inch maps which are online, they're great to find, than we had in the 1830s. We had a guy who was actively knocking down houses to try and clear people off his land, and the other accusation was, you created employment and you paid them miserable wages and you made them as far away from where they were living as possible. Smith, this was a thriving town. It went from that in the 1860s to nothing in the 1880s. One of the people who came to live here in the 1860s, and she only lived here for 7 years, but we're very, very proud to claim her as Ardclough's most famous, our sculptress, Ireland's most famous sculptress, was a woman called Mary Redmond. She was born in Tipperary. The family had started in Ardcavan, and her father got a job at the Ardclough Quarries. What she did in Ardclough that was significant, not just for her, but for the history of art in Ireland, was she went into the sinkholes for the quarry and pulled the soft mud out and started playing with it and making little figures as children do. But the teacher in Ardclough said, these figures are too good, too much talent here, not to have it developed. and she ended up going to Dublin and working in the model school there and working in the art school there. And I'm going to introduce you now to Mary and Thomas, who are going to help us along with the story of Mary Redmond, because they might know something of the fact they're both related. Another reason we can claim her, by the way, is that her family are still in the area. What a handsome woman. Look at this.
Yeah,
Regal.
yeah.
Her most famous for early work included an amazing head of Brutus, which I put on the WhatsApp group. She also did the little clay figurines, which were which we've also got, which were survived down through the generations in the family and probably were practiced for big work. Her more famous later work, there was this is the wrong side of the political divide, but there was a district inspector, Martin, who is notorious in Donegal for having arrived in the middle of Catholic Mass and marched a priest that he was wanted for making an inflammatory speech off the altar at the head of a sword and in front of all the congregation. And District Inspector Martin, people of Donegal, but she did the bust of District Inspector Martin, which was in the RIC headquarters in the Phoenix Park, and then turned up in the RDC headquarters in Castlereagh. But her most famous of all is the statue in O'Connell Street of Father Mattew. Father Mattew, by the end of the 1870s, 1880s, there was the great sort of home rule political debate on. Father Mattew was a very safe figure to put a statue up of, because nobody could disagree with the temperance movement. And he was idolised by the Irish Catholic people, but also respected by the Unionist side. So she was commissioned, and it was a big, big job. It was probably the most important commission of that, not that decade, but that period. And she was the one who won it. She was a female sculptress, be very unusual to get it. And she there's a picture in the WhatsApp group, and I'll call it up here, of the crowds that showed up when the statue was unveiled. It was sort of the soccer team coming home from the World Cup sort of crowd. And that was the unveiling of the Father Matthew statue. She was the celebrity. She was the artistic celebrity of the time. If there was RTE television at the time, there'd be documentaries on about her. No, there's one in Cork as well. There's one in a lot of towns. But sadly, the one in Cork, as you know, the boys of Fairhill. Yeah. The smell on Patrick Bridge's wicket. How does Father Matthew stick it? But that Father Matthew statue is not hers. That's the one. Now, Pauline's asked the key question. What happened last year? They built the Lewis. What happened, Father Matthew? He was carted off, sent to the Bold Corner. We don't even know where the Bold Corner is. He was taken out, and there was no sign of him coming back. And this week, breaking news, the workers will move into action next week, and Father Matthew will be back in situ in November. Wait, Father Matthew will be back in November, and it would be nice if we got a bit of wind behind Mary Redmond again. But it'd be nice to get her memory back up, because she was a huge hero. And Bridget Maguire in Ardclough School used to talk about her a lot. And she wrote an article, I think there was an article in the Capuchin Annual, and she was a local celebrity, but like for those outside Ardclough, by the way, who've come here today, and you're very welcome. Most of our celebrities in Ardclough have 4 legs. So there's very few that only have 2 legs, but she's one of them. She's great. There was what? Okay. Mona, this is important. In Ardclough School, that building we saw, there was a piece that Mary Redmond made, and the children who all came in could see it. Yeah. And was it a genuine Paul Henry?
A genuine Paul Henry.
Lord. Well, we had a genuine Paul Henry and a Mary Redmond in Ardclough. Wow, in that school. And no heating. Okay. No sewage. Tom, have you anything to add?
No, nothing to add. You've done it all. You've put it all. And you would like to mention that you did a bust of Gladstone as well.
Oh, Gladstone, yes. There's a Gladstone bust, yes. We did. Right.
There used to be 6 paintings, she told us, behind the altar.
Right.
But when they changed the altars and that in the church, they were piled up.
Oh. So our 6 paintings have gone missing as well. Okay.
Yeah, those are their brothers. I don't have very
Mary has a picture of them here if you want to gather around and see.
You can't really see it from them at all.
Okay. So where were the paintings? These ones. They were hers. Barclay Street Chapel, and they've since gone missing. This is the account of the closure of the quarries. Mr. Sexton, having no other alternative, on surrendering possession when demanded on the 1st of May last, the 9 families of Labour were formally dispossessed within the last 6 months. So he dispossessed the families of the labourers that were living in the area here. And at least 3 solvent parties expressed their wishes to step into Sexton's shoes and continue to run the quarries and to pay a fair rent for the quarries. And you rejected these offers and preferred to be to see the lands waste and the people thrown out of their houses and discarded about the country looking for employment. And the valuable machinery of the quarries that cost hundreds of pounds were torn into small pieces with sledges and sold off as scrap metal for the magnificent sum of £11. And yet you discuss all this before the Selbridge Board of Guardians with such simplicity and innocence that the sucking did not approach the charms and the sweetness of the notes. So that's the accusation. A really substantial local character, Edward Kennedy, who was originally Barnrath and then bought Bishop's Court after the Clonmel family moved out. But Edward Kennedy said he'd offered to take over the quarries and run them, and Cloncarry said no. So that's the mentality you're dealing with. And he was the allegations that most of this stuff is online. I might put it up on the Ardclough website as well. The allegations Cloncarry makes against everyone against him is that they were anti-Protestant, they were disloyal, they were against loyalism, and that they'd no respect for property. But you reading this stuff, the sort of level of debate, it doesn't really happen in Irish politics anymore. The level of debate is like what you'd get in America at the moment. You know, the name calling that was going backwards and forwards. And this guy was, the documentary evidence we have about him was that he was stubborn as a mule. He was going to shut down everything that was moving here and clear the area because it made more sense not to have it operating. And speaking of mules, there was a very important mystery which popped up in the archives as well, and it concerns Mick Buggle's donkey. But anyway, Sergeant Porter, now this is, we had Sergeant Connor lying in the bushes waiting for people to come out of the pub, and the fellow who should have been lying in the bushes was Sergeant Porter, with a name like Sergeant Porter, you know. Sergeant Porter summoned Michael Buggle, Ardclough, for allowing a donkey, his property, to wander on the public road. First of all, who would be fined for having a donkey wander on the public road? You know? But the fine was 6p, and it probably wasn't paid, was it?
Still isn't paid.
Tell me, what are your memories of the quarries from your passed down the family?
Well, my memories would be the quarries were all filled with water.
Yeah.
I came on this after.
Right.
And
father and grandfather?
Grandfather worked on the quarry, and great-grandfather worked on the quarry, and great-grandfather, Patrick Buggle, his name, he was drowned in the quarry in 1886. And at the quarry at the moment. At that time, they dug it across from the ground, and a lone bush, so, and it's there to this day. So, other than taking an odd patch of roads or that, however, like 50 years ago, I remember 50, 60 years ago, you could see all around the quarry, you could see the sheet stone, you know, the stone bit. But now that's all grown over now,
Yeah.
you know, and it was, they say there was 100 people working
Yeah.
for a livelihood.
You can imagine the activity along here with 100 people. Like,
Yeah.
like if a factory closes with 100 people nowadays, it's big news. That's big and so on.
Now they may not have a whole lot of wages.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have a big job counting it. But that's about it, yeah.
On Wednesday, a melancholy accident occurred at Boston, Ardclough, County Kildare. It appears that a young girl, about 10 years old, named Maggie Eoghan, heard her younger brother had accidentally fallen into a quarry hole, which was within a short distance of their house. And with a heroism which is rarely met with a youngster of such tender years, she bravely attempted to rescue him and lost her life, her brother being rescued in time. On Thursday, Dr. Cosgrave, coroner for North Kildare, held an inquest as to the cause of death of the girl. A jury of which Mr. Jones, the postmaster of Straffan, was foreman, was duly empanelled. The evidence was to the effect that Mrs. Eoghan left the house about 2 o'clock on Wednesday, and about 3:30 some children were heard screaming near the quarry hole, which in places is said to be fathoms in depth. She ran to the verge of the hole, and Patrick Buggle, who was working in the same field, went as fast as a man could go to the scene of what proved to be a fatal accident. On their arrival, Mrs. Eoghan and Buggle found the body of the boy floating on the surface of the water. Not being able to swim, Buggle wrenched a bough off a tree and succeeded in bringing the apparently dead body to the edge of the hole. It subsequently transpired that the boy was not dead, there was no sign of his sister. Subsequently, the hole was dragged and Michael Buggle succeeded in bringing the dead body of the little girl to the surface. And with that, we'll depart to the quarries. Right?
Well, that's another thing before you go to the park. I was down there one day with the colours so back at the club, we were doing a dive.
Yeah.
And when they were down there, there's loads of rail tracks and little carriages and machines and everything. We're still there about 50 years.
Yeah, I think they still are.
Yeah. I can remember the tracks coming down the lane there. They're probably going over for now, I don't know.
And
Taking it up.
somebody's taking it for scrap, maybe.
I had them on you to gate cattle gate.
Oh, okay.
What's going on? All was left outside. All that was left there 60 years ago was the actual stone, the stone traces of the tracks. There weren't actually tracks there. Just a few along them.
Great. Well, thank you very much. A round of applause for Thomas and Mary. And we're coming to the end of a really important part of Ardclough life, and we'll be walking down part of it. You can't get very far in it nowadays, but at one stage this road went to the Blue Door and the Kill, Straffan Road, and it was known as the Boreen. It was the mass paths. Remember I said for 1810 our church was built, but from at least the 1720s, because there's a mention of it in 1724, there was a little thatched cabin there out of the way where Mass was said on a Sunday, when it was illegal to say Mass. And people came, because remember this is Lyons Parish, and this is the centre of the parish, not Kill, which it has become. This was where people came for effectively the parish church of Lyons and Kill. And that little Mass house is the site of where the church was built in 1810 with the help of the money that was now available, and the penal days had ended, so everything could be done in public. One of our more important teachers, and in the early days of the last century, and we've been very lucky, we've had 20 teachers, believe it or not, from the time that school was built to the current principal, Mary Manning, in Ardclough School. So we can actually track almost the history of Ardclough by our teachers, and some astonishingly powerful, amazing characters. Bridget Maguire, I name-checked a little bit earlier. Nora Murray. And she came from Carrick and Shannon. She was a poet, She'd have been a friend of Joseph Mary Plunkett, the 1916 leader. She was married Sean White, who was also fought in 1916. She would be very active politically in the 1910s, and she wrote a wonderful poem called the Boreen. And she was when her published work of one of the first teachers to have a published work of poetry, a book of poetry published, and her publisher was Monsell, who was the same publisher as W.B. Yeats. They're the circles she moved in, and one of her poems was from her time teaching here in Ardclough, and it's about the Boreen. I'll finish her story before I read the poem. Her story was that in Barton, the landlord in Straffan lodged a complaint after the 1916 rising that she had been teaching seditious material in Ardclough School, and she was prosecuted. There was a case was drawn up to prosecute her for having allowed the songs of Thomas Davis to be sung in class, and for teaching Irish history in a manner which didn't suggest that everybody was happy, a happy English child, which was the poem they had to read at the time. And she was also, oddly enough, accused of allowing the songs of Padder Carney to be sung in the school. And Padder Carney was the uncle of Brendan Behan, and he was the author of the national anthem. So the case of evidence was put forward that she was to be prosecuted. Prosecution never happened. John Donovan, the parish priest in Kill, rallied behind her, and a whole load of people who subscribed to a defence fund. And when it came to the prosecution was dropped. It was a very important stand. Nothing happened, actually. It's one of those great moments in Irish history when nothing happened. But the reason nothing happened was the force of opposition to the prosecution was so strong that all the notion that teachers were going to be prosecuted for their teaching of history, Irish language and songs, nobody got prosecuted. Now, she moved afterwards to Suncroft. She married and she lived in Dublin. She'd have been very friendly with Teresa Clayton, the woman who wrote the Old Bog Road. She was from Kilcock, and she was related, oddly enough, through marriage to the Maguires, to Bridget Maguire's family afterwards. So all those little, and the other Nora Murray connection that some of you of a certain age would remember is that a programme in the 1960s called The Reardons. Maggie and the Reardons. Biddy White Lennon was her niece, and I asked Biddy White Lennon, who died sadly last year, had she any memory of our Auntie Nora, because Auntie Nora had died in the early 50s, this great Ardclough teacher. Nora Murray, and this is the poem she wrote. This is the road she's writing about, the Boreen. And Nora Murray would have been celebrating the fact that when it was illegal to be Catholic and go to Mass, Catholics came from all over the parish along this little road. There is a rugged grey Boreen, it steals its lonely way between the gorse bells full of gold that shine the night and day. The cowslips wave shy, dimpled heads along the sun-kissed green, where fairies lurk in moonlight mists and weave love charms unseen. And down below a big white bush is spreading a regal state, is guarding where the Mass path leaves unto the chapel gate. A sacred bush is over all, but with the morning dew, the skylark like a cherub sings when soaring in the blue. The heart of me goes thinking long, I feel that side by side, the dead ones wander here in joy when comes the eventide, and twilight smiles on every leaf, and whiter goes the grey, for heaven's path my Boreen is when fades the toilsome day. And this is the road she was talking about. The blue door is where it ends. All of it's overgrown. There are certain parts of it are still walkable. The right-of-way has been closed off. Landowners along the way are a bit grumpy of anyone trying to find the paths nowadays. A major artery of Ardclough life right up until the closure of the quarries in the 1880s. On we go. This is Lord Cloncarry. How many of the houses have fallen down? This is him talking only, we're within years of the quarries being closed. He said, they're all down except 4. He couldn't tell the number of individuals in the houses. There were 4 in his employment. You've closed up, this is White, the barrister cross-examining him in the inquiry. You've closed up the quarries. The water has done so. So it was in his interest that these were all springs, and suddenly instead of workable quarries, it all went from a situation where they could be reopened to having no chance of reopening it. You've not set them or sought to set them, no. Did you see any proposal for letting them in the papers? I remember reading some fine speeches in the papers. I grew tired of them though, and I didn't finish them. Did you write a letter in reference to these quarries? I don't remember. Did you read Mr. Kennedy's, and this is Cub Kennedy from Barnrath, Cub Kennedy's father, Edward Kennedy from Barnrath. Did you read Mr. Kennedy's proposition as to the formation of a company to take over the quarries? No. Did you want to set those quarries? No, certainly not. Quarries? No, certainly not. At present times and present prices. You would rather see these people turned out of their homes rather than set them. The rent was too low. You would rather have no rent than a low rent. Yes. Those people would rather have their homes than go away. I don't think so. As regard the houses they had there, they were a disgrace. But you didn't build any instead. I've built houses, but not there. So that was his response. Another allegation from George Going said that in a conversation he had in 1879, when the lease had about 6 years to run on the quarry, John Corry had told him that when the lease runs out, I'm going to close the quarries, the chapel and the school. So his ambition was to kill the quarries and kill the entire community of Ardclough. Now he didn't, I'd like to say he didn't succeed in that, but he did. He put 100 people out of work. He pulled what was a thriving town. It was a bigger town than some of the places that are now, urban centres around North Kildare, with 100 employed and a school and a chapel. And the school numbers collapsed and the teacher left. And we ended up with, a situation where Ardclough was without a teacher for a little period of time in 1885. And our argument in front of the Salvage Guardians was that the road was now a private road and that Ardclough Church and Ardclough School were no longer viable. And you could see where he was going with this. But he closed the quarries, he didn't close the community. And then Ardclough people being very resilient, anyone who played against them in the hurling field would know that. The community survived and grew stronger and is now operating out of Tipperstown in the way that the community used to operate out of Ardclough here. Sadly, there's no real remnants of how strong and how thriving this community of Ardclough that we had in between the 1820s and the 1880s, except the flooded quarries that we have here.